I wanted to make sure we went deep into brain metabolism. And now that you're diving into it, I think this is a good time to do it. A lot of times on the show, I talk about insulin resistance as a whole, and we all know it's such a big problem in today's society. But let's zoom in on the brain, your area of expertise. You've mentioned the amyloid part, but let's say somebody is just slipping into that prediabetes, insulin resistance. Let's get into all the nuance, changes in the brain, and energy metabolism as they go further and further down.
Yeah, I mean, this you could spend a lot of time just because it's so nuanced. There are so many pieces. So as I already mentioned, insulin degrading enzyme, which is called upon more than ever as your insulins are going up because you now have this insulin resistance. As your insulin goes up, your insulin receptor, which is phosphorylated at multiple sites. Again, it's a switch. And I should just parenthetically say, the big realization that we had a few years ago is that you have this system just as you go from sleep to wakefulness, and that changes all these different pieces. You know, your hormones, your EEG, all these things change as you go from sleep to wakefulness. Your brain also has these two modes, which are connection and protection. So in the connection mode, you're able to make new memories, keep your memories. You don't have a lot of inflammation and things like that. You can see a change in the signaling from APP, which is the parent of the amyloid itself. The APP is cleaved to make two fragments that support synaptogenesis and synaptic maintenance. You have a whole set of things that your tyrosine metabolism changes. Your tryptophan metabolism changes. You're changing from your sleep side to essentially protecting yourself with quinolinic acid instead. So you've got this whole set of things that changes. And part of that is related to just what you were talking about, to the insulin. So you are going from one type of metabolism to another. Now, as you start to have, high carb diets and you're now starting to get metabolic syndrome, what happens? Okay, you're exposed to more carbs. You have to respond by making more insulin. You've got to now degrade it. You're now not being able to degrade your amyloid as well. You're phosphorylating your insulin receptor. So what happens is when your insulin receptor is active and signaling normal metabolism, it is phosphorylated at tyrosine residues. When it is then turned off is when it becomes phosphorylated at serine and threonine residues. So it's literally saying, okay, there's a lot of insulin out there. Don't be so sensitive. It's a little bit like if you're always hearing music that's too loud, you're going to put on some earmuffs, for example, and you're just going to try to damp that down. That's what your insulin receptor does. Now, of course, someone puts on a Brahms lullaby, you can't hear it. And so the same thing, you're not responding normally to the normal amount of insulin. To compound that, as the amyloid starts to accumulate, it actually interacts directly with that insulin receptor, and it is preventing it from binding to insulin and from receiving that. Now, to compound that further, the amyloid also compromises mitochondria. So now you're also not able to generate the energy that you once were. So you can see how these things all come together. They're literally changing you over from a status where you are active, normal, making synapses, keeping synapses. You're now saying, no, we're in a state of having various pathogens come, etc. We've got to switch over to this state of war, basically. And so you are now pulling back. You're saying, okay, we're gonna sacrifice some of the synapses to kill these pathogens, and we're gonna live with a smaller brain. So that's of course what we want to avoid. We want to live with our full complement of synapses. You have about 500 trillion synapses in the remarkable human brain. We want to keep those functioning. We want to keep you into the connection mode and not having to go into the protection mode. Protection mode is what ultimately leads to Alzheimer's. That's one of the things you do for protection is you make the beta amyloid. So as you can see, metabolism and Alzheimer's are intimately intertwined. And for example, when you look at the FDG PET scans, the PET scans that were originally done for Alzheimer's disease, what do you see? The hallmark of Alzheimer's is reduced glucose utilization in the temporal and parietal regions of your brain. So again, right back to metabolism. There was a nice study done about a year and a half ago where they took people with MCI, basically, a mild cognitive impairment, and just gave them energetic support. It was a little bit, to be fair, it was a little bit over the top. They gave doses that were not practical for the long run. But as you can imagine, again, we're just looking at this relationship. If you're not going to decrease the draw, the inflammation, one thing you can try for at least a short period of time is to just bump up the energetics. And indeed, people improve with that. Another approach there has been ketones. And so Professor Stephen Kinane from Canada has done some beautiful work showing that just giving people ketones, again, that gives your brain is going to metabolize one of those two things. It only has two choices. It can metabolize glucose or it can metabolize ketones. And of course, what happens is as people are developing cognitive decline, they lose the ability to do both of those. So they lose the ability to metabolize glucose because of the insulin resistance we were talking about. But as your insulin is high, your insulin actually prevents you from making ketones. So now you're literally, your brain is sputtering. It doesn't have the glucose ability that it once did, and it doesn't have the ability to make ketones. So when we are treating people, we want to get both of those back. So we want them to become insulin sensitive once again, and we want to make sure that they are able to get into ketosis. We start typically with some exogenous ketones for a few weeks, but ultimately we want to be able to have people become metabolically flexible. In other words, they can go back and forth seamlessly between using glucose, ketones. They're insulin sensitive, they can make ketones, and that's really where you get the best brain function. So these are all related. Insulin metabolism, glucose metabolism, insulin receptor signaling, mitochondrial function, amyloid production, inhibition of those pathways, moving that metabolism from the connection side to the protection side. And by the way, when you do that, you switch to more of a glycolytic approach and less of an oxidative phosphorylation, therefore less efficiency. So you're really literally changing the entire mode of function of your brain.
I love this level of detail. This is exactly what I wanted. I want to try and make sure we connect insulin resistance, high blood glucose in the body, specifically with the brain, because I know it's a little bit different with, you have your blood-brain barrier. I know insulin in the rest of the body is needed to get that glucose into cells. In the brain, when it comes to neurons, it's not needed. Let's talk about, as somebody is building up that hyperinsulinemia, that high blood glucose, what's happening specifically in the brain because of the differences there.
Yeah, it's a good point. So first of all, as you're building this up, you're changing over from that connection mode to protection mode. You are changing your overall metabolism. And so you are literally going into this protective state. And it's interesting to me that the brain flips into this protective state when it sees pathogens, but it is doing a similar response when it is low in nutrients, when it is low in oxygenation. So there seems to be, it's not just it is protection against pathogens and toxins, but it's also protection when you have low ability, low support, low oxygenation, mitochondrial function, all these sorts of things. So as you mentioned, there are some differences, but the blood-brain barrier, as you just mentioned, the blood-brain barrier is not what it was once thought to be. And here's what I mean by that. Years ago, the thought was, okay, up to a certain size of molecule, you can pass the blood-brain barrier once you get to a certain size. And that's the way it was originally shown with dyes. 2 dyes, one that was a large molecule dye, one was a small molecule dye. The small one gets through, the large one doesn't. So there was this idea that there's this general barrier there. It has not turned out to be that simple. And here's an example. A few years ago, there was an experiment done where the scientists took some candida, because it's something that's common. We're all exposed to candida. And the question is, this particular yeast, how long could it be excluded by the blood-brain barrier? Now, this is huge compared to the size of the blood-brain barrier. I mean, this is not just a big molecule. This is an organism. And they thought, maybe it's a month, maybe it's 2 months. Could it ultimately get through or not? And the answer was it got through the blood-brain barrier in minutes, not months. So it's clear that there are many ways to get through. There are specific transporters, for example. This is why people have been interested in magnesium threonate. There is a threonate transporter that helps the magnesium so that it's a little bit easier to get more magnesium into your brain with magnesium threonate than it is, for example, with magnesium glycinate, which is not to say that some won't get in with the glycinate. So there are multiple things going on with the blood-brain barrier. And of course, there are specific glucose transporters as well. So that you've got the issue of what's coming in, what's not coming in, how much is pathologically coming in, how much is physiologically entering the blood-brain barrier. So in the same story, of course, with drugs, there are some drugs that are quite good at getting through the blood-brain barrier. It depends part on their hydrophilicity versus their hydrophobicity. It depends on whether they are hanging on, they're taking advantage of specific receptors like threonate or other things like that. It depends on a lot of these sorts of things, whether it's happening. And just as you can imagine, what would your brain do when your brain then says, oh, wait a minute, I see that there are things peripherally going on. There's stuff in my brain now that I'm recognizing change in my microbiome. And of course, there's now multiple papers on a, quote, normal brain microbiome, which wasn't suspected until just a few years ago. It was always thought the brain would be completely sterile. That has not turned out to be the case. So what it does when it's under assault is it opens up the blood-brain barrier. It says, please send me some white blood cells so I can get rid of these pathogens. Please send me the appropriate cytokines. So I've got to now get this stuff. I've got to give access to these various approaches to deal with the various pathogens and insults to the brain. So that, again, there's a very dynamic situation with your blood-brain barrier. It's not just a static system for excluding certain molecules. So all of those things are going on.
When somebody is suffering with cognitive decline, how profound can the changes be when somebody either takes exogenous ketones or switches into a ketogenic diet, providing that substrate, if a big part of the problem has been that energy production in the brain?
Yeah, this is a really good point, because one of the things that we still need is the ability to look and say, aha, this is the rate of these different things. We often talk about 36 holes in the roof. So you've got all these different things that could be contributing to your cognitive decline. It's not always clear at the beginning, well, what's the dominant player? What's number one? What's number two? What's number three? Just as you said, for some people, it's energetics. For some people, it's that ongoing inflammation. For some people, it's just overwhelming toxicity. And so what happens is, as you begin to address these, you can see. So, for example, I was just talking to a patient recently. When she addressed her energetics, boom, clearly improved. So that was her rate-limiting step, was that energetic support. For those people, things like ketones and creatine can be dramatic, and they'll see, marked improvements. Things like nicotinamide riboside, ways to improve overall energy. They'll also often do well with things like EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy, some of them with HBOT, things like that. These are essentially addressing that energetic gap. For others, they'll have significant toxicity, and the energetics are not the rate-limiting step. So you're going to have some detox before you're going to see a lot of improvement. But yes, for the right people, dramatic improvement. And you probably remember Dr. Mary Newport, who has published a number of books on ketones and used these on her own husband, who had Alzheimer's disease. And when she first started the ketones, she saw a dramatic improvement with him. Now, in the long run, of course, there's more going on. You've got to look at other issues as well. But getting that energetic burst can be very helpful for people, no question about it.
One thing you wrote about in your latest book, which I really found interesting, was this early connection 100 plus years ago of neurology and psychiatry.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of talk in our world these days about people going into ketosis, using ketones to help with mental health challenges.
Yes.
Tie that bit into this.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So, Charcot, the famous neurologist of the 19th century, was in Paris at the Salpêtrière, trained a whole generation of wonderful neuropsychiatrists, including Freud. But what happened is, as they started to look more and more at pathology in the brain, they started separating things into people where we don't see pathology, people who have schizophrenia, things like that, and people where we do see pathology. So this really was an artificial separation, so that they would be talking to the people who didn't have obvious pathology, and they would be looking for medicines for the people who had pathology. Now what's happening, of course, we understand much more about molecular pathology and chemical pathology. And I have to give huge credit to Jeffrey Bland, who started functional medicine about 30 years ago now, and looking much more at the biochemistry. This goes back to things like so-called orthomolecular psychiatry, where you're looking at what is actually driving the problem. And these are all part of the same things. And just as, of course, Dr. Christopher Gardner from Harvard that you alluded to with respect to things like ketones and psychiatric illness, these are all molecular changes that we can see. Just because you don't see pathology, with a standard stain is not good. Doesn't tell you that you don't have some molecular pathology going on. And so now these are coming back together. And it's just as you said, the things that we're using to treat Alzheimer's disease successfully and get people to improve their cognition, the same sort of approach is now being used in psychiatric illness. And as Dr. Gardner has written, often it is an energetic insufficiency, just what we see with neurodegenerative diseases in his patients who have psychiatric illness.
And the other area we could bring in too is epilepsy. Again, just trying to make connections between energetics in the brain in these different areas, and how typically a lot of this has been siloed. Yeah. And maybe bringing it together and looking at brain energetics as a whole is a piece of the puzzle here.
Absolutely. And of course, years ago, it was found that ketogenic diets were one of the best things for epilepsy. And even people who would not respond to anti-epileptic drugs would often respond to high levels of ketones. Now, in general, those levels were a little higher than we're using. In Alzheimer's disease, we're using 1.0 to 4.0 millimolar beta-hydroxybutyrate. That's the sweet spot. In the kids who were being treated for epilepsy that didn't respond to drugs, it was at a 6 to 8 millimolar range typically. So they were a little higher. Of course, none of those are at ketoacidosis level up at 15 and things like that. But the point here is that you are providing more energy. It's an alternative form. So you're now having both the glucose and the ketones that are that are giving you more energetic support for your brain, getting everything working, your mitochondrial function, oxygenation, blood flow, really helpful. And again, which is why things like EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy, can be so helpful. People just getting out, and why that exercise alone has had a big impact on cognition.
All right, we'll come back to exercise, but I want to just stay here in metabolism a little bit longer.
Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that part of your program is a more mild ketosis. You have your
Yes.
Keto Flex 12-3. So
Right.
obviously it's part of the focus here. But any reason not to go deeper into ketosis and stay in ketosis, at least in the early stages, somebody with cognitive decline, I could only see providing that extra substrate as being something that could help.
Yeah, it's a good point. What happens for many people, though, is if you stay in it for too long, you don't get the energetic benefits as much. So cycling in and out seems to work better. In other words, metabolic flexibility, giving you that glucose utilization being optimal and the ketones going back and forth it's a little bit like a Prius. So, you've got two methods to make your Prius go, and going back and forth, is going to give you obviously the best gas mileage. But if you there do seem to be suboptimal results if you just stay in it 24/7.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
About 15% of our population dies of Alzheimer's. So about 45 million of the currently living Americans will die of Alzheimer's. We can reduce that number.